The USS Oklahoma was never supposed to stay. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Navy did something almost impossible. They raised the entire battleship from the bottom of the harbor. Their plan was simple: repair what they could, tow the ship away, and erase the scars of December 7th from Pearl Harbor forever. But that's not what happened. Instead, more than 80 years later, people are still asking the same question. Why is the USS Oklahoma still there? Because the ship everyone remembers isn't actually the ship that's still with us. And the real answer isn't about where the battleship ended up. It's about what happened inside her during 15 terrifying minutes that changed American history forever. And even today, investigators are still uncovering pieces of her story. At 7:55 on the morning of December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor looked almost peaceful. The water was calm, the air was warm. Most sailors aboard the USS Oklahoma believed they were beginning another ordinary Sunday. Some were finishing breakfast, others were writing letters home. A few were still asleep below deck after a late watch. Nothing suggested they had less than 15 minutes left to save themselves. Then, engines appeared overhead. At first, many sailors barely looked up. Military aircraft flying over Pearl Harbor wasn't unusual. But these weren't American planes. Within seconds, explosions echoed across the harbor. Bombs struck nearby battleships. Machine gun fire ripped across the decks. Then came the weapon that would seal the Oklahoma's fate: torpedoes. The first one slammed into the port side with enough force to throw men off their feet before anyone could react. A second explosion followed, then a third, then another. The ship shuddered violently. Steel groaned, lights flickered. Steam burst from broken pipes. Water rushed through the torn hull faster than damage control teams could respond. The Oklahoma wasn't simply sinking, she was rolling. And that made all the difference. Most battleships settle gradually after flooding. The Oklahoma didn't. Every new torpedo pushed thousands of tons of water into one side of the ship. Within minutes, the list became impossible to stop. 5 degrees, 10 at 20, 30. Decks became walls, staircases became cliffs. Heavy equipment tore loose and crashed through passageways. Sailors who had been running toward escape ladders suddenly found themselves climbing what felt like the side of a collapsing building. Then came the moment no one aboard would ever forget. The battleship kept rolling, 45 degrees, 60, 90. Men who had almost reached safety suddenly fell backward into darkness. Compartments became death traps. Doors that had once protected the crew now trapped them inside. And then, the USS Oklahoma turned completely upside down. The entire attack had taken less than 15 minutes, but for hundreds of sailors inside the overturned hull, their nightmare was only beginning. And what rescuers heard next would haunt Pearl Harbor for decades. Outside, the attack continued. Smoke covered Battleship Row. Burning oil spread across the harbor like black rivers. Explosions echoed from every direction, yet rescuers couldn't ignore the Oklahoma, because beneath the overturned hull, people were still alive. At first, the sounds were faint, then unmistakable. Banging, knocking, metal striking metal. Hundreds of sailors trapped inside the ship were desperately trying to tell rescuers exactly where they were. Every knock meant someone was still alive. Every minute mattered. Navy workers rushed across the overturned hull carrying cutting torches. But this wasn't like opening a locked door. The Oklahoma's armor was several inches thick. Every cut took time. Too much heat could ignite fuel vapors. One wrong move could flood another compartment or collapse the tiny air pockets keeping trapped sailors alive. The rescue crews worked around the clock. Sometimes they broke through just in time. Exhausted survivors crawled out of holes cut through the hull after spending hours trapped in darkness. Some had shared the last breathable air with complete strangers. Others had listened as the knocking around them slowly disappeared, because not everyone could be reached. One by one, the sounds stopped. When the rescue operation finally ended, 429 crew members had lost their lives. It was one of the deadliest losses suffered aboard a single American ship during World War II. Most people assume that should have been the end of the USS Oklahoma. It wasn't, because what happened next had never been attempted before. Pearl Harbor couldn't remain a graveyard of sunken warships. The harbor was America's gateway to the Pacific. It had to return to full operation as quickly as possible. Some damaged ships could be repaired, others would be scrapped where they lay. But the Oklahoma presented an entirely different challenge. She was upside down, 27,000 tons of twisted steel resting on the harbor floor. No Navy had ever attempted to flip a battleship of that size. There was no blueprint, no instruction manual, no guarantee it would even work. Many engineers believed it couldn't be done. Others warned the hull might simply tear apart during the attempt. Still, the Navy decided to try, because abandoning the Oklahoma in the middle of Pearl Harbor simply wasn't an option. Months passed as engineers designed one of the most ambitious salvage operations in naval history. Massive steel cables were attached to the hull. Powerful winches were anchored to Ford Island. Each cable had to pull with nearly perfect precision. Too much force, the ship would break apart. Too little, nothing would happen. Finally, the operation began, slowly, painfully slowly. The cables tightened. At first, nothing seemed to move. Then workers noticed something almost impossible to see. The hull shifted, just inches, but those inches proved the impossible might actually become possible. For weeks, the operation continued. Steel screamed under enormous pressure. Every movement was measured, every adjustment calculated. No one knew whether the next pull would rotate the ship or destroy it completely. Then, against every expectation, the Oklahoma began to stand back up. Against every expectation, the USS Oklahoma was upright again. Newspapers called it an engineering miracle. From a distance, it looked as if the battleship had survived. But the illusion didn't last long. As engineers entered the ship, they discovered damage no photograph had revealed. Entire decks had twisted under their own weight. Support beams had buckled. The hull itself had warped during the capsize. Years of seawater had destroyed engines, wiring, and machinery deep inside the ship. One Navy engineer reportedly described it as trying to rebuild a ship from a skeleton. The Oklahoma could float, but she would never fight again. And that's where another difficult decision had to be made. The United States was now fighting a war across two oceans. Every shipyard was already overwhelmed. Every ton of steel mattered. Repairing the Oklahoma would consume enormous resources while producing a battleship already considered outdated. The Navy reached a painful conclusion. The ship wasn't worth rebuilding. Instead, anything still useful was removed. Her guns, her equipment, her instruments, everything that could help other warships return to battle. The Oklahoma slowly became an empty shell. But even then, her story refused to end. Because one mystery still remained. Hundreds of sailors had died inside the ship. Many had never been identified. During the war, investigators simply didn't have the technology to answer every question. Some families buried loved ones whose identities were uncertain. Others never knew exactly where their sons had spent their final moments. For decades, those questions remained unanswered until science changed everything. More than 70 years later, advances in DNA testing allowed forensic teams to identify sailors once believed to be unknown forever. Families received phone calls they never expected, brothers, fathers, grandfathers. Finally, they had names again. It became one of the largest military identification efforts in American history. The USS Oklahoma was no longer just a shipwreck. She had become an unfinished story, and history wasn't finished writing it yet. By 1947, the Navy sold the Oklahoma for scrap. The plan seemed simple. Tow her to the American mainland, cut her apart, move on. But once again, the ship had other plans. As the Oklahoma crossed the Pacific under tow, hidden structural damage began tearing the old battleship apart. The stresses of Pearl Harbor, the salvage operation, years of corrosion. Everything finally caught up with her. Water slowly entered the hull. The tow crews fought to keep her afloat, but there was nothing left to save. Hundreds of miles from Hawaii, the tow lines were released. The USS Oklahoma slipped beneath the Pacific Ocean for the second time. Unlike Pearl Harbor, there were no photographers, no crowds, no ceremony. Just a battleship disappearing into one of the deepest oceans on Earth, and that's where she remains today. So, why is the USS Oklahoma still there? Because there was never about a location. The battleship left Pearl Harbor nearly 80 years ago. The steel lies somewhere beneath thousands of feet of Pacific water, its exact resting place still uncertain. But the Oklahoma never truly left. Every visitor who walks past her memorial, every family that finally receives an identification, every historian searching for one more answer, every diver looking across the quiet waters of Pearl Harbor. They're all standing in the shadow of the Oklahoma's story. And perhaps that's why people still ask the same question. Not because they're looking for a ship, but because they're looking for closure. Some shipwrecks become treasure. Some become museums. The USS Oklahoma became something far more powerful, a reminder that even after a ship is gone, its story can remain anchored forever. And somewhere beneath the Pacific, in complete darkness, a battleship that changed history is still waiting. Maybe not to be found, but to be remembered.